The ideas that gave birth to our nation are the ideas that our nation is resistant to right now, and we should talk about that all the time.
In a world where narratives are shaped by corporations and gatekeepers, independent voices matter more than ever. Badlands Media brings together citizen journalists, researchers, and independent thinkers.
The truth is triggering.
Question the narrative. Explore the facts.
It's authenticity, courage, resilience.
Search for the truth others won't.
It's not about being first or being right.
The information war is changing.
It's about being authentic.
Embrace the friction.
Embrace the friction.
Shut the f*** up.
Authentically antagonizing. Join the movement.
I'm going to say how I feel.
Follow Badlands Media.
This is about the future.
The Badlands. What are the Badlands? Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
If you are not moving forward and exploring and learning and discovering, you are falling backwards. We want peace, and we want a future that trends with less violence. Know thy enemy, know thyself. And if you are deceived in your own arrogance and your own dominance of the past, that what you did in the past is sufficient to win in the future, eventually you're going to be a dead man. And this Constitution that America has is the best hope of humanity. We have the creativity. God has given us the brains to create our future, to build it. The way to do that is not to ignore a new domain and new technologies. How do we use this knowledge God has given us, glorify God, and not let evil people use it as a weapon against good people? We don't have to be victims. Technology does change fate. All right, everybody, welcome to Space Revolution. Today, my co-host is Ghost. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, Steve, so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And this is a conversation I've been looking forward to for a while.
Yeah, me too. So this series of the Space Revolution is designed to help people understand what is coming, and that this revolution that is unfolding in space has implications for us on Earth. And I've been waiting a long time for this specific conversation, because the conversations up till now have been about how it's going to impact the energy market, the information market, the resource market, and the implications those have for us. But one of the most important impacts is what we're going to talk about today, and that's geopolitics. And so the title of this one, though, is The Dawn of Geospatial Politics, which a dear friend of mine, Chris, coined, because it is going to usher in a new era of potential for good for humanity. But with every potential for good for humanity, there's the potential for evil people to take it, hijack it, and use it for evil. We've seen that even with the information domain. When the internet came out, it became a place for people to hide and for people to subvert others, steal, cheat, and dominate others or enslave others. And we're trying to take that back right now, where we design tools to keep us free and independent with our civil liberties and our privacy, but not let lies be told. So this hunt for truth, this movement of truth, the dawn of geospatial politics is what the space revolution is going to usher in. And there's no person better to talk about geopolitics and what geospatial politics might mean than Ghost.
Yeah, and I think that is a brilliant term. Chris did a great job coining that, and I hope it becomes just widely used. I know that you and I share a passion for geopolitics and specifically geography and how it's shaped geopolitics throughout history. And so the idea of the geography of space, or the lack thereof, and how it will impact geopolitics, I think is a fascinating topic and discussion that will become a whole new field of study moving forward.
Yeah, no, I agree, and so even though this show, I avoid talking about current events, because I want this to be about the long-term trends of how technology changes the fate for humanity. There are things going on right now that really speak to this issue of how geopolitics is going to be shaping itself into geospatial politics, because space will become a dominant geography, just like the open oceans became a dominant player in the economics and the commerce of the global society. How air power, the airplane, and the invention of the airplane transformed the ability for the economies, and those had geopolitical consequences. When America dominated air power in World War II, we were able to paralyze Germany and Japan in such a way that we could avoid them from taking over the world. And space is going to be the same. So one thing I'd like to start out with is just to, many people will say, well, I don't get it. Space, we went to the moon in the 60s, and we just had 4 astronauts go and, circle the moon again and come back. How can this change geopolitics? And I want to remind them, our listeners, that the reason that geography shapes politics is because it first shapes your economy. And your politics are really just a way of governing yourself under the values you believe in. And so if you can have a strong economy, you can defend your values. If you have a strong economy, you can buy things that help you, defend yourself, protect yourself. And when you think about space, think about this. Space is actually not that far above your head. The geopolitics of America, for example, in the early days was that we had natural ports and we had rivers that flowed all the way into the interior of America, the Mississippi River, the Ohio Valley and the Ohio River, the Columbia River, and on and on and on, the Rio Grande. But so it was easy and natural for us to be able to mine resources, deliver things to and from. And then when we dominated air power, because of all that strong economy, we could take airplanes and fly anywhere. But space, think of it as like it's just above your head. And when we can build infrastructure in space that can take anything that is from any point on the planet to any other point through the medium of space, or build something in space and bring it to Earth, or see something, or have telecommunications, everything is just right above your head. Your friends are just right above your head, and your enemies could be right above your heads. This ability for space to be able to touch every point on the planet without having to build the infrastructure on the planet is the potential to change the economics of the globe, and by so doing, to change the geopolitics of the world, where now a politician can have leverage to say, don't mess with me. Because if you do, I have the power to paralyze you, to stop you. And if we do this right, we can stop you without violence. That's kind of what President Trump is doing right now. And that's why I say the current events are kind of a tell. Because here's the point I'll make, and then I'd like your comments on this. What you saw in Venezuela, and what you saw in Iran, and what you are currently looking at in Iran is a result of President Trump leveraging the power of space power, to be able to paralyze an enemy so dramatically using space that he can send helicopters in and hijack the president without losing one American life. Think about that. The power of space paralyzed the exact right elements of an entire nation that was bristling to defend itself against this armada of ships that was parked off their shore, saying, come and get it, America. And when we came and got it, paralyzed. They couldn't do anything. And they didn't know why, they didn't know how, and they still don't. Okay. President Trump has gone in there, and the lives we've lost were due to, a midair collision on over friendly soil or friendly fire. It wasn't the Iranians. Why? Because President Trump was able to use space power to leverage a political outcome, and there wasn't a damn thing the enemy could do about it. They don't know how, they don't know why, and they never will, as long as we stay ahead of them. That's space power. And you just saw an executive order that came out that you brought up, Ghost, that we can talk about, where President Trump is saying, okay, we are now going to usher energy into space so that we can lay the foundation of America dominating space for the defense of our values, the defense of our Constitution. So this is how powerful space is. This is what people have been talking about since the 1960s. President Trump is the first one that was gutsy enough to actually say, okay, we need a space force. He put it into law with the help of Congress. And now we are reaping the geospatial political power that comes with that visionary decision to invest in space power.
Yeah, all of that is so fascinating. And the key word for me is infrastructure, because when you look at the history of civilization, the places that are known as the cradle of civilization, 4 rivers, the Nile River, the Tigris Euphrates, that would be Iraq and Syria, the Indus River Valley, which is Pakistan, India, and I believe it's the Yellow River in China. That's where civilization began. And that was just the natural geography of the land. And then once technology allowed them to develop ships and roads and eventually railroads, people could stop living on the coast and on rivers, and can move inland and still have access to civilization the same way that people on the coast did. And so this idea, one of the places that you and I discussed off air, Africa, which has really no deep water ports to speak of, and no rivers that can help you traverse the interior. That's a place that is perhaps the richest in natural resources, but the most inaccessible. And being able to bypass the need to develop infrastructure, which can be very costly and not only in resources and financially, but also time-wise, take years and years to build railroads and roads and the necessary infrastructure to excavate and the logistical routes to pull the resources out. Being able to just go and deliver or extract those resources through space, for me, is fascinating. Air bridge, I think, is the term that's often used in the military. And just having air bridges everywhere, I think it could just change everything.
Yeah, it did. And so another way for people to think about this is, back in the day when you had a telephone, you had a cord that connected to the wall. Your telephone was attached to a cord, and we cut the cord. Okay. Then your TV, it had a cable, and it was cable TV. And then we cut the cable. The beautiful thing about the space revolution is that now we can cut the electrical wire. In other words, electrical power, because of power beaming. And we've talked about this before in other shows, where you can beam the sun's power from space, where the sun never sets. In other words, sun is always shining in space, and you can beam that power to Earth. So to your point about infrastructure, when you think about, like, the village I grew up in, about 10,000 feet on Mount Cameroon, there's no power plant there. There's no water system. There's no, telephone wires or electrical wires. There's no cell towers. There's no infrastructure. Okay. It's people getting up every day and hiking miles to get their drinking water for the day, farming, gathering, hunting, collecting, getting just enough food for the day, and going to sleep and doing it again the next day. The amount of money it would take to build a power plant and to build cell towers and to build water systems, it's too expensive, and the people are in poverty. But if you can deliver all of that from space without building one thing on the surface, meaning except for a receiver, where you can put a rectenna up and now you can receive power from space. You can now use that power to draw water out of the air with the technologies of a company like Genesis Systems. And now you can you basically cut the cable. You don't need a cell tower because the satellite acts as a cell tower for your phone. Your phone is just talking to the satellite, right? Like we have right now in America. And now you can take the entire continent of Africa and you can tap into their human intellectual potential. Think about how many geniuses are born in Africa that never get to see the light of day with the rest of the world. Connect them now to the internet and think about the serendipitous ideas and brilliance that can come from those people that are geniuses that now have the ability to teach themselves the entire body of knowledge of all humanity. And that you don't have to spend the time and the money to build a power plant. You just beam power right to their village. You don't have to build a huge water system to clean the water and to deliver it to the homes. You can pull it out of the air from every village hut with a small unit the size of a small generator. And now when you have water, now you can grow food. When you have electricity and information, you can understand what's going on around you. You can organize both economically and politically. So no despot or tyrant can hold you slave using water, food, shelter, information, or energy as a weapon against you. Because that's the trap that the African continent is in. And I got to see it as a kid and grow up watching it. And when we release that human potential on the entire continent of Africa, man, hang on to your hats, because now the whole world will benefit from the beautiful minds that will come from that continent.
That's actually a great analogy that I didn't think about, the internet. Because if you think about how knowledge has been consolidated in time and history, the idea of a library, like the time it takes to write the books, to gather the books, to organize them, to develop something like the Dewey Decimal System, so then other people can come in and then access the books easily and read them, and to have that then in the palm of your hand in the form of an iPhone or a smartphone, and then being able to use AI or a search function to be able to find the information that you want to read about very quickly, as opposed to having to spend a lifetime reading every single book and then draw on that knowledge. That, if the library and the books in the library represent the infrastructure and civilization and the time it takes to develop all that, space technology, as you described it, represents the internet and the smartphone. And now, as you said, somebody in a third world country who doesn't have the infrastructure, the benefits that other places have, can access that information far more instantly.
That's right. No, it really, and so when we talk about geopolitics, how geography shapes politics, it now creates an even playing field for all of humanity, where America no longer has an advantage because we have beautiful farmland and rivers and natural seaports. Those were advantages for the last 1,000 years, or since the beginning of recorded history. Space changes that, because now anybody who can invest in space power can have access to the entire world, and anybody on the planet can have access to the world's knowledge. It really is the great equalizer. And whoever dominates the energy infrastructure in space first will dominate the space domain. And I would rather have our values dominate that space domain than the values of China or any other country that is grasping for that straw. They are, or for that chalice. They are. It is China's national vision to dominate the economy of space in order to dominate the global economy on planet Earth.
Yeah, they're great points. And so I think for people to grasp, the significance of this moment and how we really are ending one age and beginning a new age, perhaps having some context for how why geopolitics have evolved the way they have, and why this new frontier is not just going to be a continuation of everything that's come before. I think talking about the books that you suggested, the suggested reading, makes a lot of sense.
Okay, well, let's start with the first one, which is called The Revenge of Geography, which is a broad book that talks about these, these dynamics you just mentioned. And then we'll talk about the American example of why America is so powerful and why America came onto the scene so fast in the context of the arc of history. And then from that, we can talk about why space is going to be the accelerant of any country that decides to invest in that infrastructure. So let's start from the beginning. And why don't you give me your thoughts on this first book we're going to recommend to the readers called The Revenge of Geography?
Yeah, this is a great book by Robert Kaplan. It's one that General Kwast has recommended pretty much every time you and I do a show together. You bring this book up because it's a great book, and I suggest people go read it. I've gotten a lot of feedback on the shows that I do, like the maps and taking the time to talk about the geography on the map. If you enjoy those little side quests, that's what this entire book is. And so I asked AI to develop some illustrations for each chapter, so I can just kind of quickly demonstrate how the book conveys information. And so you can see it goes by chapter by chapter. It spends the first 2 chapters kind of explaining the philosophy and the premise, giving some examples. And then it runs through basically every continent. It explains how the geography of each continent shaped civilization, shaped culture, and provided either advantages or disadvantages that led to the evolution of empires, but more importantly, the evolution of nation states, when those empires collapsed. And you can really understand in depth some of the more broad points that I make on my shows. If you read this, Iran being a relevant example, being totally surrounded by mountains. This is a place that has had 6,000 years of continuous civilization that's just changed management from time to time. And one of the reasons being is that Iran is just surrounded by mountains. And so it's made it very impervious to invasion. That just being one example. Africa, to your point, being another example, a lack of deep water ports. So it's very hard to access even by ocean, and no rivers that are easily traversable outside of the Nile. And so those disadvantages really prevented civilization from developing and evolving the way it did in other continents. And there's also in chapter 2, he mentions Nicholas Spickman, who evolved rimland theory. And here's a diagram of what that looks like. The idea that there is this world island, Eurasia, right? And the two different lands in this world island would be the land power, which is effectively Russia, and then the rimland, which is basically Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, and how those latter places are all accessible by sea, and then Russia was just one giant open field, effectively the steppe that runs from basically Hungary all the way to Siberia, and the eastern coast of Russia, and how those two different dynamics really informed how culture and civilization evolved there. And just fascinating ideas that I think really help you appreciate how important geography has been to every element, every aspect of our life, including logistics, including trade, including economy. And so really understanding that, wrapping your head around it, I think gives you a much deeper appreciation for why space is so different, because space doesn't have any of those things.
Yeah, and space is that geography like a blanket that lays over all of this with equal access to every point for the same price point. And this is why we are at such a unique inflection point, and why President Trump was willing to put up with the sarcasm, ridicule, and humiliation that he took a beating for when he said, "I want a space force." The reason he said, "I want a space force," is because we are at the edge of an epic change in the human race. And that epic change will come because of the geography of space and the fact that technology now allows us to build infrastructure in space that delivers goods and services to people on Earth in the form of energy, information, and resources, unlimited. I mean, really reaching to the heavens for for everything humanity needs, because it's almost an infinite source, from the asteroids to the other planets, and the sun, and the energy. And so we don't know how this will evolve. We don't know how this journey is going to go. But the one thing we do know is if we build it with the values enshrined in our Constitution, those will be the values that go forward. And the first thing you need is a force that can bring discipline to the rule of law. And what I mean by this is the following. When we had finally shipping in the oceans, pirates, thugs, and thieves started running amok until nations built navies to protect those ships so that entrepreneurs can make reasonable risk decisions on new markets, so they can invest money into that capital that builds the infrastructure. Without the rule of law, without predictability, your entrepreneurs, your inventors, your innovators can't move forward. And so what President Trump did in 2019 in his first term is he laid the foundation of a space force that can hold anybody accountable if they do something that's counter to American values. So if an astronaut is hijacked or killed on the moon by another nation, we can do something about it, okay? And what's so ironic is how history repeats itself and human nature doesn't change. You remember how many people in the Federalist Papers in America said, we don't need a Navy. You know, we've got the oceans protecting us. We don't need a Navy. And the Federalist Papers, you know, our founding fathers argued for years about it's too expensive, or, you know, but thank God, the clearer heads prevailed, saying it may be expensive, but it's more expensive to have your country taken from you by somebody who does have a Navy. And so we built a Navy, and thank God, because, you know, take a look at what's going on even right now. But yet when President Trump said, well, we need a space force because space is going to be the sea of commerce that will dwarf air, land, and sea combined, because there's no friction. And he was laughed off the stage. There, you know, there were TV shows mocking him and mocking the Space Force.
Yes.
It would be like back in the Federalist Paper days, people mocking the creation of a Navy, you know, and just think it's a joke, when they basically, if they don't do it, they're going to lose their souls. They're going to lose their lives, their livelihood, their country, their values. And so here we are. He pushes through that beating that he took from the American people. Well, it was really the deep state and the fake news, because they didn't want him to be able to create power. But you know, so it's ironic. But you know, think about this. The reason the sea it changes politics is because it's less expensive to work through the friction of the water than it is to work through the friction of the land. Okay.
Yes.
Why are airplanes valuable? Because it costs less money to work through the friction of the air than it does the friction of the land or the sea. Now, an airplane is still more expensive than a ship, but it's faster. So speed is also a critical factor, getting the right thing at the right time to the right place for the right reason by a nation that needs to do something to maintain its power and defend its values. So space has no friction. Okay, so now I can get anything anywhere on the planet at any time for the same price point than any other competition on the planet. Think about what that's going to do for the economy of America and therefore the geopolitics. And it's already had an impact. The creation of the Space Force in 2019 and what it has done in Venezuela and in Iran, and what President Trump could do to leverage other countries with no violence. That's the big thing. No violence. Okay. And prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon that could kill millions of people. And he did it without losing a life at the hands of Iran anyway. Accidents do happen, and those two KC-135s that collided, you know, is very sad. And but those men and women were working to defend the world against a rogue nation with a nuclear weapon, and their lives are not lost in vain. And we are here to make sure that investment is secured for our children and grandchildren. So space is that powerful, and it's already manifesting its geospatial politics. where we have a president that can leverage nations that it seemed impossible to leverage without losing a life, and they can't touch us. Now, in 100 years, we figure it out, and they may be able to do something. But by then, we've discovered the next great leap, whether it's quantum or something else. So, this is truly a masterful dynamic that we are watching unfolding in our own lifetime, where somebody has enough vision and enough guts to lay the foundation for the next great leap. And the next great leap is the dawn of the geospatial political age.
Yes, thank you for that. And I just realized that I think StreamYard may have put me on the wrong microphone, so hopefully my sound is better now. But three quick points I'd like to make to communicate what you just said, and I think maybe transition us to the second book. The first being, you're right. A lot of the founding fathers laughed at the idea of wasting time and money developing a navy, because they kind of took the heartland idea from Nicholas Spickman and wanted to apply it to this new continent. And it was John Paul Jones, who wasn't even an American colonist. He was a Scotsman who became a fugitive for the British and was chased into North Carolina, who pleaded with them to give him a ship. And finally, wise men like Benjamin Franklin gave him a ship, and he took that one ship, sailed across the ocean, and gave a proof of concept by attacking the British on their own land and causing so much havoc that the Americans were the whole world, the Europeans and the Americans sat back and said, wow, one person, like one ship could cause that much damage. And then others followed in his footsteps. The other two examples I would give kind of demonstrate Spickman's theory. The first would be a continuation of that. After the American Revolution, John Paul Jones is recruited into the Russian Navy as a rear admiral by Catherine the Great, the leader of Russia. She's good friends with Benjamin Franklin. And it was actually the Russians who defended the Americans from the British, because after the American Revolution, the British continued to attack American ships and capture the crew and conscript them into the Royal Navy. And we couldn't defend ourselves because we didn't have a navy. So it was the Russian Navy that then went in and secured the waterways so that America could trade and could engage in commerce, which really developed a geopolitical relationship between America and Russia, which leads to the third point. And this is something that my co-host on Breaking History, Matt Arrett, talks about all the time, and he has far more expertise in than I do. But in the 1800s, we developed something called the Transcontinental Railroad, which allowed us to connect the East Coast to the West Coast and really realize that vision that some of the founding fathers had about the power of the heartland. And we turned around, and the same people who developed the Transcontinental Railroad in the time of Lincoln helped the Russians develop the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which traversed the heartland that Nicholas Spickman discusses in his theory. And so those two latter points I made really communicate that we've been deceived, I think, in the mainstream, the modern mainstream, that Russia is an adversary. Russia has actually been a tremendous friend to us since the American Revolution. And, it was the logistics, not only waterways, but also the heartland railroads, and those joint cooperative efforts to engage in commerce and see a vision and have economic values, bilateral economic mutually beneficial values that led to a partnership that really should have been continued throughout the 20th century and unfortunately wasn't.
That's a great point. And that's what you see President Trump doing right now. He is taking a look at the strategic common ground between countries and building on that economically. It doesn't mean that we are not cautious of them. It doesn't mean that we are going to be friends. But it's this recognition that, when you cooperate, you can do so much more together than you can alone. And if the deal is written properly, the terms and conditions, you protect your own sovereignty and you protect your own ability to act unilaterally, meaning that if today you are my friend and tomorrow you are my enemy, it doesn't matter to me. I can still do everything I need to defend my values and defend my economy, my sovereign soil, and my culture. So, this is how we learn from history. The history you just talked about gives us these little nuggets. And one of the questions that always comes up as I talk about space in this regard, where it is truly a game changer at economic power, which then means political power. And they'll say, well, gosh, when something comes back into the atmosphere, it's moving so fast, you need a heat shield. And I will tell them that that is an artificial construct of the fact that we just didn't have the technology in the 60s to do it any other way. And the reason we come in fast is because we don't have the fuel in space to slow down. You spend all the fuel getting out of the gravity well at the launch, so you don't have the fuel to slow down. But when we have that infrastructure in space where you can refuel, whether it's a nuclear electric engine that you're refueling from a nuclear power plant in space, or whether it is a solar powered battery that you are refueling, or chemical fuel if you want, although that's very old fashioned or will be soon. You can descend down from space to Earth once you slow down as light as a feather. And I showed a video, I can bring it back up again, the men that go up in these hot air balloons to the edge of space and then jump out and to pull their parachute and then land. There is no reason why all the infrastructure in space cannot deliver anything to any point on the planet as soft as a feather once you have those fuel stations in space, the infrastructure. And so, for people to understand that. And the reason space is so valuable is there's no air molecules to get in your way. A 200-mile-an-hour wind will kill you, or at least the Volkswagen that's flying through that wind will kill you. Tornadoes, winds are damaging. We had tornadoes go through Michigan. God help the people up there that, lost their lives in that last night. But the reality is there's no air molecules in space. And so you can travel at Mach speeds and get anywhere on the planet in less than a few minutes, and then descend down as light as a feather because you can slow down and then float down to the surface. It is different than how people think, because they haven't really studied the geography of space and what that means for transportation, for energy, for information, and how those things build economic power. So this gets us to the next book that we're going to talk about here, and that is in the past, when we didn't have as much technology to deal with these economic issues, the game changer was geography. And that's why we have the term geopolitics, because if you had the geography, then you had the economy, then you had the political power. So geopolitics, the geography drives the politics, which then defends your values and keeps your civilization alive. The reason America, and this book called The Accidental Superpower, right here, the reason America came onto the scene in 1776, and in less than, in about 100 years, just over 100 years, we were such a dominant force. And within 200 years, nobody could come close. How could a civilization come on the scene so quickly and dominate the global geopolitics and economics so powerfully, so quickly? And that's what you'll enjoy reading in this book. It was the good fortune that God gave us between the colonists and then the Louisiana Purchase and all the other things that got us a nation from sea to shining sea. That this accidental superpower, that we couldn't have done much to prevent ourselves from being a superpower, because we had these natural deep sea ports, we had natural rivers flowing through, the things I was talking about at the beginning. And these were the geographic reasons why we were a superpower, because of the economics of getting the right thing to the right person for the right price point at the right time. And better and cheaper and faster than anybody else on the planet. And so our economy thrives, and then we can export to other countries. That ocean, which is a pathway to new markets, and space puts all that on steroids, all of it, and with no friction. So the cost of transportation is, once you get the infrastructure in place, like the railroads or the gas stations and the intercontinental, or the Eisenhower interstate system, Once you have the infrastructure in place, then the economics grows up everywhere. Every gas station has a restaurant and a hotel and shops. Well, in space, you have that infrastructure. And now, because space is just above your head, you just have a few minutes between wanting something and getting something. You think Amazon is impressive, where you order something in the morning and it's on your doorstep in the afternoon. Think of that same capability for every person living on the planet. All 8 billion plus people on the planet can get anything, anytime they need it, from space for the same price point as anybody else on the planet. It's going to transform the opening of not only the continent of Africa, but in like Indonesia, where, you know, there's 1 billion people, okay, plus, and and they live in these crags on the mountains without adequate water, without adequate roads. And now you can deliver something. You don't need a road, you don't need a railroad, you don't need power lines, you don't need telephone lines. You can get all your information, all your energy, all your water, therefore all your food from space at a price point that you can afford. It's just, I am so excited about how humanity is going to evolve. And if we do it right, we can have the information systems to make sure that evil cannot hide in the dark, as they have in this industrial age, where the deep state was able to hide things away. Human trafficking, child trafficking, money laundering, all these things that were hidden inside of systems that the average person couldn't see. With the information age and AI, if we build the tools right, we will have a flashlight that can shine on anybody on the planet. And if they're doing things that are good, they can, the privacy, the independence, the self-sufficiency is all there. But if they are doing something evil to other people or the planet, they are discoverable. And if they are discoverable because of evil they're doing, we can stop them.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for that. There is something providential, I think, about the founding in America. And to your point, the geography that this continent, North America, offers really lent itself to that, because there were so many limitations in the old world in various places. Either you had great waterways for trade, but you maybe had rocky territory, such as the case in Greece, and so limited farmland. That forced you then to trade with places that had more fertile farmland, like Ukraine, like Eastern Europe, where they had abundant farmland, but they had no rivers. It was a lot of picking and choosing of different geographic elements that all seem to come together. So I had AI create another set of graphs where America has all of these things, where we have we're protected by oceans. We have these amazing river systems that run deep inland and allow for large ships to traverse the land without having to build roads and railroads, which eventually come later. And then, of course, just abundant fertile land in the Midwest, and then abundant natural resources that hadn't been really tapped into, because the people who had lived here before didn't develop the economies to do that, didn't have the need for them. And as the author gets into, this system, this globalization that develops is very artificial. It's driven by a number of factors, mostly politics that shape it, malevolent politics, so to speak. But it's also the advent of technologies and resources, because you have concentrations of oil, which drives the industrial revolution. And so places that have oil, which tended to be, the Middle East was a big one. That's where the concentration of power in the worst possible way happens and destabilizes the region and leads to a lot of conflict that we are obviously still dealing with now. And so one of the things that he talks about that I think is really interesting is the end of the globalized world. This graph chart on the left showing the international trade as we now know it to this post-global world, which communicates more of these regions where the region can kind of have everything it needs and be more self-reliant and not at all dependent, like as you were pointing out before. If you're dependent on a foreign land, the minute that foreign land becomes an adversary, you are in a very compromised position, and we're seeing that happen right now, by the way, with Europe specifically and Britain. And so I think this really aligns with the things that we've discussed on Badlands Media, regions of responsibility, the sovereign alliance, this shift away from globalization and globalism, and obviously space and space technology, I think, really feeds into that. But at the core of all of it, to the point of this author and to the point that you made, the benevolence of the American people. I won't say the American government, because I don't think the American government has been very benevolent as of lately. But the benevolence of the American people and the bounty that we've been given by God, we almost have a responsibility to kind of lead the way into this next frontier, the same way that Catherine the Great of Russia was a benevolent leader and protected American ships from the British Empire. We need to now be a benevolent steward in making sure that this technology incubates in responsible hands and then proliferates, so that it is not consolidated in the hands of evil men.
Thank you for showing that. And you're right. That's, and then there's another, then the next step, as we build this infrastructure in space, the space technology, the space revolution, it becomes this great equalizer where if you have a country like America with our Constitution, the rule of law, founded in principles of morality and a faith in God, then you truly can usher in the golden age where evil can't hide. So one way for the listeners to think about this too is I'm going to show a picture that kind of shows the roots of, and I'll make this big so you can see it fully, but the roots of shipping traffic in the world. Now this picture was taken in 2015. Okay, so it's about a decade old. So it's just gotten that much more powerful as far as the roots, but the trend is generally the same. So just to orient everybody, this is the Gulf of America right here, and all the energy that's coming out of the Gulf of America to the rest of the world. Here's Northern Europe, okay, the North Sea. Here's the continent of Africa. And again, not a lot of feeders coming in because, like you said, there's not a lot of deep water ports there, and there's a lot not good interior lines of transportation. Here's China and Indonesia down here. Right here is what we're talking about right now with Iran and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE. And the reason I bring this up is because of, again, my dear friend Chris, who is one of the young mighty men of our age, who is inventing technologies for truth and for knowledge. Think about space, and so the people that get the advantage are the people that have these natural ports, and the people that don't are the places where they don't have the natural ports. But now think of this great equalizer called the space revolution, where you can have a port right here in the middle of Siberia. You can have a river in the middle of Siberia for the same price as getting, or cheaper than getting something right here that doesn't have to go on the railroad or the roads or by airplane to your village. Every village, look at Africa, totally dark, okay? Yes, there are roads and planes that fly around in there, but imagine space being able to descend down and deliver, whether it's a satellite that acts as a cell tower for your phone, or beamed energy to give you electricity, or resources where you have something that's done in space and can be descended down to you like Amazon, delivered on your doorstep by a quadcopter. And now the great equalizer is you can have a port and a river and a road right to your front door, anywhere you live on the planet. And you can have water and food. And the people that are designed, the ability to grow food in space is something that people don't talk about a lot, but it's real. Space is filled with the same dirt that is the same stardust that made Earth, okay? So you have dirt in space. You have so much water in space, it's everywhere. It's in the form of ice, but it's everywhere. And all you need is a little controlled sun energy, and you can melt that ice into water. The greenhouses you could have in space, growing food abundantly and then delivering packages of food to any point on the planet, no matter where you live, is something that the space revolution technology has right at our fingertips right now. It's just astounding to think about what can happen with this blanket of commerce. It's basically, the ocean, the space ocean of commerce that can deliver anything anywhere on the planet at any time for a price point that pales in comparison to the price it takes for us to deliver things deep into the interior of Siberia. That's the implications of the space revolution. And with that economic implication comes the geopolitical power. And that's why the term geospatial power, geospatial politics, space power is something people really need to start getting familiar with, so that we as the people with the power are shaping a moral, ethical journey that is kind to Mother Nature and kind to Mother Earth and kind to humans everywhere.
Yes, and that's such a great chart. Actually, if you could pull that image up for a second, so I can make a point that the three choke points in maritime trade, the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, and the Strait of Malacca. You and I were just discussing the Strait of Malacca, which is the access point between the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, at Indonesia and Malaysia. And you can see like the very, very dense, large white lines on the right. That is all of that is accessible through the Strait of Malacca. That's a natural choke point. The other two are not natural. They're actually artificial. So before the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal existed, you had to sail all the way around South America and Africa in order to traverse the world. And then I think it was 1865, the Suez Canal was completed by a French British company. And that is the white line you see between Africa and the Middle East. That's the Suez Canal. The Panama Canal, obviously, between North America and South America, completed a few decades later at the end of the 1800s. And those fundamentally transformed logistics and fundamentally transformed trade. And those are just two little choke points where trade became a little quicker than it was before. And what you're talking about is basically an air bridge to anywhere in the world. So it's like creating a Panama Canal everywhere, where you can just take the shortcut no matter which trade route you're taking. And so it's actually really hard to wrap your head around how big of a deal that's going to be.
Yeah, it is hard to know how it will unfold, but the technology is here and businesses are going to figure this out. Just like it was a reasonable business decision for a country like America and Teddy Roosevelt to build the Panama Canal, and it cut the price and the speed in half. It took half as long to get there and half the cost because you didn't have to go around the Horn of South America. So you're right; it does transform. And the businesses are going to figure it out. They're going to build it. But if you don't have a leader, if you don't have a leader like America that is establishing the rule of law, the lines on the road that we drive on the right side here, doesn't matter if you decide on the left side or right side. You need rules, and then you need somebody to hold accountable those pirates, thieves, and evil people that will try to steal what good men and women build. And so that's what's I'm so grateful for is we have a Space Force now. We are already using it to leverage geopolitics in a way that trends with less violence. It is consistent with our Constitution, and as the days go on and businesses build more and more, it's just going to explode. And so this gets to the executive order that came out on the 14th, basically 2 days ago. And it of April 2026 here, and that EO is President Trump now in injecting the foundation of space infrastructure, which is energy. So if you want to bring that up, and we can talk to that just a little bit, and I'll tell you what, we've been asking for this executive order for years. All of us space advocates that understand what we just talked about, understand the implications of geospatial politics and what this is going to mean for the entire human race, and the need for America to lead so it is not a violent journey where evil people take advantage. It is a peaceful journey where America is the guardian And that's why Space Force has guardians, the guardian of the global economy that will emerge in space, that will dwarf air, land, and sea combined. So why don't you talk a little bit about this EO, because this is the foundation for that bright future.
Yeah, quick aside, I was just thinking, I guess we have to look forward to Space Buccaneers, and maybe that'll be the next premise of Burning Bright's next book.
There you go.
Right, is about Space Buccaneers.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is dated April 14th. It says the top memorandum for the heads of executive departments and agencies from Michael Kratsios. The subject is the National Initiative for American Space Nuclear Power. And so it references President Trump's executive order EO 14369, ensuring American space superiority, dated December 18, 2025, established the bold and ambitious goal of enabling near-term use of space nuclear power by deploying nuclear reactors on the moon and in orbit, including a lunar surface reactor ready for launch by 2030. As directed in the EO, the Office of Science and Technology Policy will coordinate implementation of these goals through the National Initiative for American Space Nuclear Power. This memorandum provides guidance to federal departments and agencies on achieving the president's priority for space nuclear power through this initiative.
Yeah. So the one thing I'll point out in this next paragraph, and then we won't go into the detail because people can read this on their own, and I want them to. But having been a warrior in the big bureaucracy of the Department of War my entire life, I know full well how the bureaucracy tries to stop you, the military-industrial complex. And so there's a line in there that's very intentional, based on advice we've been giving to the executive branch for decades, and that is, agencies will establish cost-effective partnerships with private sector innovators to meet these near-term objectives. So when they say the term private sector innovators, these are not the Boeings and the Lockheed Martins. I mean, they'll do the long term because they're big companies and they're valuable to the country, but they are too slow and too bureaucratic, just like the deep state. They're too slow and too bureaucratic to move this fast, but small innovative companies are not too big and too slow. They are fast and nimble and agile. And so that, this is why this is feasible. People will look at this and say, you want to put a nuclear power plant in space by 2028 and then on the moon in 2030? There's no way you can move that fast. Well, they haven't met the space industrial base in America, because we know how to do it. And the other point I'll make on this executive order, though, is really important for people to understand. This is not pie in the sky. In other words, people will say, well, nuclear power plants are dangerous. Why would you put them in space, where you have less control? The reality is, we have been so successful at incrementally innovating on small nuclear, modular nuclear power plants, that the probability of that reaction going high order is lower than your kitchen table going high order, just organically. It's just amazing how we have learned how to control the release of energy in the nuclear realm, both fission and fusion, and both of those are coming to fruition in ways that are safe and effective. But like I said before, they've made these small enough that now you can actually lift a fully built nuclear power plant into space. But like my company, we do modular. So we partner with the modular nuclear power providers, and we can then bring up all the Lego blocks and snap it together in space. And now you can build large power capability in space that you can either beam to Earth or beam to different places in space. You can power spacecraft using nuclear, where just like our nuclear Navy powers its submarines and its aircraft carriers with nuclear power plants. So this is President Trump taking the next step of dominating energy, which is the foundation of the entire rest of the growth of economic power, which is then, in this case, geospatial politics, geospatial power.
Yeah, and so I think this can lead into like the final segment. We'll read this paragraph, but the final segment about geopolitics and space. So establishing the National Initiative for American Space Nuclear Power, the United States will lead the world in developing and deploying space nuclear power for exploration, commerce, and defense. Agencies will establish cost-effective partnerships with private sector innovators to meet near-term objectives that include safely deploying nuclear reactors in orbit as early as 2028 and on the moon as early as 2030. Achieving these near-term objectives will establish technological viability essential to unlocking space exploration, commerce, and defense applications.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Please respond.
No, that's exactly right. And further down here, it directs NASA and the Department of War to work together. Because in the past, there was not a willingness to work together, and this is forcing our agencies to start working together. Because if you want 1,000 times more scientific discovery and exploration, turn it into a business case, and with that energy, now NASA can do everything it wants to do, even with a smaller budget.
Yeah, and it says right here that they're going to conduct design competitions to enable near-term demonstration and use between NASA and Department of War, and I think that brings up a great dynamic, because there's probably, I'm sure there's a competition between those agencies for budget and other resources, and that kind of competition, I think, can go one of two ways. It can become kind of like a sibling rivalry, like a brotherly competition where they kind of push one another to get better every day. Or it can turn into something really ugly, something existential, where one department or one entity wants to see the other one destroyed or minimized in order to suck out the resources for itself. And I think you see that same dynamic play out at the geopolitical level between nation states and empires in this age of artificial scarcity that we've been forced into. And so, as Russia and China, they announced in August of last year when we were at Deadwood that they were going to be teaming up on their own moon base. And that was also when the United States said that they were accelerating their plans for a moon base. We also got this story, though, I think it was like 10 days before Deadwood. And this isn't a space story, but it's deeper U.S. cooperation with Russia is coming in the Arctic. And we saw Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's economic envoy to the U.S., really talking about this online, and how the U.S. and Russia, there are opportunities for them to cooperate and work together to develop the economy of the Arctic and the exploration of the Arctic. And I think, that kind of brotherly competition, it's a carrot and a stick. Because we don't want to be naive as we go into space and go into this new frontier, but we also don't want to proliferate and perpetuate the artificial scarcity and the existential conflict that we saw in the Cold War era, where it's us or them. Like, the only way we can thrive is if China and Russia are destroyed or hollowed out. And so I think finding that balance between a joint vision where we can work together in places that overlap and align, but also maintain our sovereignty. So if they ever decide one day that they want to become an adversary, we can still be self-reliant and independent, and the benevolent superpower to make sure that they don't weaponize these technologies against humanity.
That's right. And, there's no question that that's President Trump's intent here, is to be strong, carry a big stick, be, gentle and kind, but carry a big stick and use it when you have to, and be independent so that you have that sovereignty. And that's, this is consistent with history. In other words, if you take a look at history, when you are, even with somebody that has a different view, that could be your enemy if you're not careful. If you have economic cooperation and you're talking, there's less potential for war and violence. But this has been the trend over the last number of decades, where there's these camps that say, oh, you can't talk to Russia because they're the bad guy. And it is so antithetical to a peaceful future. It is so antithetical to history and the lessons we know about people that think differently, being able to get along. Economic cooperation is the key. Communication is the key. That's what President Trump is doing. He does not have any illusions that he has to be careful, and that at a moment's notice, a friend could turn into an enemy, and we have to be prepared for that. But it is this realization that if you want a more peaceful future that trends with less violence, you invest in economic relationships and communication. And then you have the power and the leverage to have a competitive advantage. So if they do something, you can paralyze them in their tracks, and there's not a damn thing they can do about it. And that's what space power is doing right now in Venezuela, in Iran, and it can be our friend, and it can be the weapon of choice to paralyze our adversaries without having to use any violence. It's great.
It's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Well, I want to just thank you for joining me. I know we've just hit the tip of the iceberg here. One, I appreciate you suggesting these books for people to read so that they can understand what is coming and why this space revolution is so monumental at this epic moment in the history of mankind, and why we are so also lucky to be alive right now. I expect to see partnerships in this space future with other countries as well, for the reasons I just talked about. But I also want you to kind of just close us out by suggesting a few questions that you would like lingering in the minds of people that are starting to dig into this, trying to understand what the space revolution is all about and why it's so important to understand for the people with the power in America that drive the politics. Why is it important to understand these things? What questions should they keep in the back of their mind as they read these books and as they watch current events unfold?
Yeah, so that's great. I think there are a lot of conventions that we have been indoctrinated to believe. One of them being that Russia's evil and that we shouldn't be speaking to them. Another is that Africa is incapable of developing civilization, and they are just basically a liability for the rest of humanity, and are always going to be kind of a disaster of a place politically. What we are seeing right now, and I've been tracking this now for a few years, a place like Burkina Faso, which is the fourth largest producer of gold in Africa, but one of the poorest places in the world. 80% of the people there do not have electricity, despite the wealth that comes out of there and goes to the rest of the world. The Russians have signed deals with them to build nuclear power plants for them. They have achieved their sovereignty against the globalist world order, but they are under threat because they have ISIS now. Money is being diverted away from Ukraine and into Africa, and they are now fighting ISIS. And so seeing benevolent leaders, good men, stand up and try to deliver civilization to their people through their own self-interest, not for the rest of the world, but for themselves, and using technology. I think a place like Burkina Faso specifically is going to become a case study for how quickly a primitive society without electricity can be pulled out of the hole and brought into a first world nation status with nuclear power, and how that can change the world for everybody. Because if they can do that, then everybody can do that. And seeing how their political system develops and how benevolent it becomes, not because they have great technology, but because they have good men who are willing to stand up against evil.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I couldn't agree more. I look forward to the village I grew up in, being able to throw off the shackles of tyrants and despots that take all the money from USAID and from the NGOs, put it in their pocket. And you go there and you see the chief of the village living in a palace on top of a hill, driving multiple Mercedes. And there are children literally dying of thirst and hunger at the bottom of the hill. Because they have been using the economy as a weapon against the people. It is just such a tragedy, and it can be rectified literally overnight when those people have the right information and they have access to the right energy and infrastructure. And it doesn't have to be terrestrial where it's vulnerable. It can be from space. And the hope for humanity, if good people like the American people guide the politics of this geospatial political reality that's coming of age, if we shape it, we're going to win. So the questions that ought to be lingering in your mind is, what are my politicians deciding with regard to space policy? What are the companies that I'm investing in doing to build a more peaceful future with space technology, so that we land in this new era of space power better than we landed in the eras of the past, where we figured out deep sea navigation and shipbuilding, where we figured out railroads and cars, where we figured out airplanes. Now with space, we want to do this with all those wonderful lessons learned of the past. So we do it where we're kind to Mother Nature and we're kind to human nature.
Fantastic. That's a great note to end it on, I think.
All right. Well, thank you, Ghost. I look forward to our next one because we can dive so much more deeply into these subjects, but we'll frame it and keep it short and sweet and ask our listeners to start digging in and doing their own research, because ultimately this revolution we're in right now, where we are trying to wake America up, starts with the American citizen realizing they have to take some time to study and learn on their own and not be deceived by the information warfare that's trying to tell them a lie, to put them to sleep so they can be enslaved once again. That's the Great Awakening. And that's why this show is short. And I'm asking you to do the research, to get into a habit of learning on your own and not just listening to others tell you what they think, but you develop your own opinion based on information that you gather and then triangulate truth. Don't believe any one source, but when you read 2 or 3 sources, you start getting a sense for where the lies lie, where the deception lies, who has an agenda, who's trying to push you in a certain direction, and you start coming up with your independent truth that is based on multiple views, so you can see the portion of truth that rises above the sea level.
Knowledge is sovereignty. And thank you so much for having me. I love these discussions and look forward to having more in the future.
Well, thank you. And we'll see you next time.
In a quiet town where beards grow wild and lips dare to crack without permission, one woman has suffered.
Hi, I'm Margie, and I'm Jadriet's mother.
But the world would come to know her by another name, Madame Margie, the moistureless.
Jay came home with a lip balm. It's called Soft Disclosure.
With one miraculous application, her power awakened.
Within one day, my lips were healed. It was miraculous.
But salvation came at a cost. For in the shadowed lands known only as Badlands,
You boys at Badlands are so handsome.
she saw potential.
You're covering up your beautiful faces.
And she made her demand.
Shave them all off,
Or face the consequences. Beard oil will not save you now.
and you'll look so much better.
This summer, moisturize wisely and guard your beard. Because Madame Margie, the moistureless, is always watching.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.